Away from diplomatic matters now, a new United Nations report is warning that the threat from Islamic State and Al-Qaeda extremists is growing, especially in Africa and Syria. The report identifies Africa as the epicenter of global terror activity, with Al-Qaeda-linked Jnim expanding in West Africa and Al-Shabab consolidating power in Somalia and forming links with Yemen's Houthi rebels. In the Sahel, Jnim now reportedly conducts complex attacks using drones and IEDs. Syria, meanwhile, is becoming a strategic hub for both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, following the ouster of President Bashar al-Assad, with over 5,000 foreign fighters involved in December's offensive in Damascus. ISIS also remains a global threat, with a deadly vehicle attack in New Orleans that left 14 people dead, the worst in the U.S. since 2016. The report highlights financial challenges for ISIS, including plummeting fighter salaries and the adoption of covert funding channels. Now, African Affairs analyst Amoda Musugodi joins me from Ibadan, in your state, southwest Nigeria, for more. Good to have you on World Now. What's the import of this UN report that Africa remains the epicenter of terror activity?
The truth remains that since the crisis in Libya, Africa has witnessed, such a very terrible situation from, the whole disintegration, the whole crisis in Libya led to proliferation of small arms, across Africa. We saw how that is playing out in Mali, for instance, and of course, we have also seen how that is also affecting Nigeria as a country as well. So you would see that that report by the UN is almost a known fact. Even way back in 2014, while ISIS was so strong, there were reports. I remember there was one by the Counter-Extremism Project, which foretold of what would happen, of how terror groups, globally, has seen Africa as a hub and a place of hibernation. And we saw how that has played out. We also have reports that there was going to be lack of funding, and that the recruitment process for these, terrorist groups, we had them getting recruitment done via Telegram and some other social media platforms, and the funding was going to get reduced, and so you see them go into small crimes like kidnapping, banditry, and to a large extent, that was in 2014. We saw how that has played out in Nigeria, for instance. We've seen how that has also played out in Mali. The reason is we have seen contested spaces in Africa because of, one, there's been a very weak regional, governing system, as well as, lack of collaboration between these governments or the military and the affected communities. So that lack of collaboration, the lack of legitimacy, has become a major problem, across Africa.
And do you suppose that the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Hamas war could also, in some way, have an effect? I'm talking about the fact that perhaps focus, has shifted to these areas, with Africa being left alone. Do you think so?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Yeah, I'm curious as to what you think about the Israel-Hamas war and the Russia-Ukraine conflict on one hand, impacting this, because a lot of attention seems to be on these areas and their conflicts, and it does appear as though Africa has been left alone. So do you think there could be any correlation?
The truth is, I talked about the place of weak regional government. And that's why we've seen, even Russia trying to hold sway with, its own, what we call private military organization. So you see a lot of PMCs coming into Africa. And every crisis globally has a way of leading to a projection of small arms, a proliferation of small arms. And because of the weak border systems across Africa, we become a victim, as a result of that. So the weak border system across Africa, particularly in the Sahel, makes Africa a ready victim. It makes Africa a ready hub. Don't forget that, companies manufacturing these arms need to sell them. where crises are evident. And so Africa becomes, the next place where these arms can be sold. And definitely, the crisis, involving Russia and all that has definitely contributed, to the current state of terrorism and, insecurity, across African continent.
But what must countries in the Sahel now do to stop these terror activities?
Well, it's simple. We need, a stronger regional governing system. It's unfortunate that the AU, for instance, has been doing next to nothing. We saw, for instance, what happened when, the multinational joint force, MNJTF, was formed. And now that was able to nip in the bud or even curtail the spread of Boko Haram, Ben, or ISWAP as we had it. Now, with the death of President Deby of Chad, we saw how that effort has gone down the drain. And we've also seen in almost 3 years, we've had almost like 10 coups, across the Sahel. That tells you of how weak, the regional space is. So there's a need for that collaboration among countries. And more so, there is also a need for governments in Africa to deal with their legitimacy problem. See, people would only open up to a government they see as their own. And so as long as they don't see it as their own, you would always have that legitimacy problem. And if you have a legitimacy problem, you will not be able to protect them. I think it was Che Guevara that said that you cannot protect the people who do not see you as a protector. So that is a major challenge. So we need to work on, our weak regional governments. We need to also talk about collaboration. Africa also needs to look at exploring other means, and by other means of conflict resolution, I mean going harder on the hard measures of conflict resolution. We've become very, very weak. We have depended so much on the West, and that has not helped to a large extent. So we need to look within, on how to resolve this conflict.
Now, that UN report, stated a number of things also, including increasing financial strain on ISIS, with fighter salaries hitting record lows, and the new covert methods being used by terrorists to move funds undetected. How dangerous is this?
Well, it's very dangerous. I can tell you that, in fact, I've seen, because of, some, counterterrorism units, organizations I belong to, we've seen how they use the rights, they invite letters, they send letters, to recruit people, baiting them with monies, huge money at that. There were Telegram, groups that were open, channels that were open on Telegram for recruitment. There were channels that were open on some other social media platforms like Facebook, although there's been a huge clampdown on these channels. But it tells you of how serious that movement has been. And of course, we also have on-ground recruitment processes where they use persons on ground. So it tells you that we are dealing with something big on our ends. Unfortunately, governments across Africa do not tend to see these as something serious. And we are seeing the repercussion. Does it not bother you that in spite of the efforts of different governments and their military, we keep having a surge in the number of these criminal elements? So we need to do more about also beyond routing. We seem to be reactionary and not proactionary. Right. Proactionary in the sense that how are they doing? How is their recruitment base like? We need to deal with that. How do they get their softwares and their hardwares, for all that they do? We need to also find a way of dealing with that. So it's important that we deal with it seriously.
All right, so we hope that this report is a wake-up call also for action. Amuda Musubgod is an African Affairs Analyst. Thank you for your time on World Now.
Hopefully.